For 4 years, the disappearance of 5-year-old Summer Wells has stood still until now. A witness says her mother, Candus, was seen driving away from Ben Hill Road after reporting her daughter missing. Satellite images reveal soil changes near a shallow creek just 30 meters behind the house, a location never included in the official TBI search. And Candus's phone, allegedly, factory reset, the very day Summer vanished, logged back online 2 months later from the same Tennessee network. 3 fragments that were once dismissed as noise now align into a pattern: a second drive, an unsearched creek, and a digital trace that refused to disappear. Together, they may finally expose what really happened on the hill that day and how a child can be erased without ever leaving home. June 15, 2021. 6:30 p.m. Candus calls 911 from her home on Ben Hill Road. Her 5-year-old daughter, Summer Wells, is missing. Within minutes, police, neighbors, and rescue teams rush to the property. Everyone believes Candus stayed home, panicked, waiting for help, calling out her daughter's name across the hill. That's the version repeated for 4 years. But one detail changes everything. A local resident, later interviewed by the Chronicles of Olivia, says they saw Candus's truck driving on another road after she'd already called 911. The road is over 20 minutes from her house. The sighting time, between 6:30 and 7 p.m., sits right inside the first hour of the search. If that statement is true, it opens a hole in the official timeline. It means that while everyone thought Candus was at the house, she could have been somewhere else entirely. Candus's own interviews sound calm and consistent. She says she planted flowers with her mother, sent Summer inside to play, looked for her, called 911, and waited for police. The picture is simple: a mother who never moved. But the witness account replaces stillness with motion. It puts her truck on a rural road heading away from Ben Hill at the exact time rescue teams were moving toward it. That road, retraced on camera by Olivia, takes roughly 20 minutes each way. A round trip fits neatly inside the half hour before police arrived. That's just enough time to meet someone, drop something, or get rid of something small. It's important to say, this sighting has never been confirmed by TBI. There's no cell tower data, no dashcam, no public record to prove it. But there's also nothing disproving it, no statement, no log, no correction. And in forensic work, a hole in the record can be as telling as an entry in it. Investigators use a term for this kind of gap. It's called a false alibi window, a short period where someone looks present but isn't. The trick is simple. When a crisis starts, attention scatters. Everyone runs in different directions, and each person assumes the others can see where everyone is. In that confusion, a single unobserved absence disappears inside the noise. On Ben Hill Road, that chaos started the moment Candus dialed 911. People were shouting, searching, calling neighbors. Deputies were pulling up the gravel drive. In the middle of that noise, one person leaving the property wouldn't stand out. Later, in interviews, Candus said firmly, "I never left the hill that evening." That's an absolute denial, no hesitation, no room for error. Linguistic analysts know that such certainty often hides uncertainty. A person who truly doesn't remember says, "I don't think I left." A person protecting a version says, "I never did." It doesn't prove deception, but it draws attention to the very thing they're eager to close. Now look at what's missing. 4 years later, there's still no mention of any GPS extraction from Candus's vehicle. No mileage check. No tire analysis. Either those tests were never done, or they found nothing worth sharing. Both possibilities keep that 30-minute gap open. So what could happen inside it? In forensic reconstruction, half an hour is enough to move an object a few miles away, even on Tennessee backroads. It's enough to reach the small creek west of the property, the one that's never been part of the official search. It's enough to explain why search dogs lost Summer's scent at the end of the driveway. And it's enough to separate a genuine search from a staged one. A false alibi window doesn't always mean guilt. It can come from panic, a parent driving off, desperate to look anywhere else. But panic leaves traces, phone calls, gas receipts, witnesses. Silence leaves none. When a timeline has noise everywhere except for one missing piece, investigators look at that silence first. This case has that silence. From 6:30 to 7 p.m., the public record goes blank. No call logs, no confirmed sightings, no verified data. It's the same half hour the witness says a truck was on the road. If Candus truly stayed on the hill, the record should show her there. If she left, then every event that follows, the search, the interviews, the media statements, begins with an unspoken edit. When was she last verifiably seen at the property? When could she have left without being noticed? When did her digital trail end? All three answers point to the same 30-minute gap. That's why the missing drive matters. It's not just a rumor. It's a measurable absence, a window of time that fits perfectly between the call for help and the arrival of help itself. Inside that window, something could have been moved, hidden, or destroyed. 4 years later, there's still no confirmation of that drive, but the logic surrounding it hasn't changed. The moment a timeline depends entirely on one person's word, it stops being a record and becomes a narrative. If Candus Bly wasn't at the house in that crucial half hour, after calling 911, then who was shouting Summer's name when officers arrived? Was it a real search, or a performance meant to fill the silence she left behind? The question now isn't who searched. It's who drove, where they went, and what they needed to leave behind before the police reached Ben Hill Road. And the answer may start just 30 meters below that house, in a narrow line of water that no one ever tested. Behind the Wells house, past the swing set where Summer used to play, the ground drops sharply into a line of trees. At the bottom of that slope, about 30 meters from the back porch, runs a narrow creek. It's shallow, slow-moving, bordered by soft clay and thick grass. In satellite images, it looks unremarkable, a thin thread of water cutting across a dense patch of green. But it sits directly below the last known location of a 5-year-old child who vanished in daylight. That creek was never mentioned in any official search report. Not once. And that absence, like the silence of the missing drive, matters. The Wells property is perched high on Ben Hill Road, isolated, surrounded by forest. The back of the house faces west. The slope behind it rolls down into that creek, before rising again toward another ridge. Locals describe the terrain as uneven, cluttered, and almost invisible from the road. A place you wouldn't notice unless you lived there. For Summer, it was part of her playground. The swing set sits right above the slope. A few steps down, the trees thicken, and the creek disappears from view. If a child wandered downhill, no one from the front yard would see it happen. If someone wanted to hide something, it's the only direction that offers instant cover. Several community members have pointed out that on June 15, 2021, the very day Summer was reported missing, a crew of workers was clearing brush and leveling ground near that same creek. In comments archived from early videos, locals describe seeing trucks, chainsaws, and small bulldozers operating through the afternoon. They mention the constant hum of engines and metal tools striking stone. One claimed to have heard a high, sharp scream around that time, but it was dismissed as the sound of a machine. Another said they noticed the smell of fuel and burning oil in the air for hours afterward. None of these details appear in any TBI release. They come from residents and viewers, not investigators. They remain unverified, community-sourced information, but they form a consistent thread, a group of workers, heavy equipment, loud noise, and a creek that no one officially searched. In forensic analysis, that combination is significant. Loud machinery creates cover, both auditory and visual. A person could move unnoticed within 50 meters of a running engine, especially on uneven terrain. The presence of trucks means access, paths cleared, tires flattening soft soil, space to maneuver. It's the kind of environment where a small object, or even a human body, could be placed, buried shallow, and overlooked. The creek itself would have made an ideal, blind spot. Its depth, less than a meter, would not carry away a large object, but the slow flow and muddy bed could easily hide smaller items, shoes, clothing, or a plastic bag weighted with stones. The soil there is damp year-round, which accelerates decomposition and masks scent. Search dogs trained for human remains lose effectiveness in saturated clay, and if the area was disturbed by digging or construction noise on the same day, any trace odor would have blended with the smell of fuel and dirt. 2 days after the disappearance, some locals reported a strong, sour smell, rising from the woods behind the Wells home. It was mentioned briefly in community threads, then ignored. The assumption was that wildlife or stagnant water was to blame. The creek, however, was never cordoned off or drained. If any forensic sampling occurred there, it was never disclosed. From a forensic standpoint, this omission is striking. In child disappearance investigations, standard protocol directs search teams to check all natural water sources within 100 meters of the last known point. The reason is simple. In both abduction and accident scenarios, water absorbs evidence. Clothing fibers, hair, bodily fluids, all degrade faster there. Failing to test such an area is not just an oversight, it removes one of the most critical environments from analysis. In 2024, several online analysts compared archived satellite images of the Ben Hill area to newer imagery. They noticed a faint discoloration along the creek line directly below the Wells property, a lighter patch of soil about 5 meters wide. The change appears between images taken in 2021 and those updated after heavy rains in 2023. No construction, no flood damage, no recorded landscaping in that zone. The color difference could be meaningless, variations in moisture, shadow, or vegetation, but it could also indicate ground disturbance, digging, filling, or erosion caused by human activity. These comparisons, of course, are not official. They are community observations, not evidence. But they echo a familiar pattern. Each time an unexplored corner surfaces, it belongs to a location that should have been obvious from the start. Authorities stated that more than 5,000 acres were searched by ground and air, with drones, K-9 units, and divers. Press briefings praised the scale and coordination of the effort. Yet in all those reports, every map, every statement, there is no mention of the narrow creek just 30 meters downhill. They mapped fields miles away, drained ponds a county over, but not the stream directly behind the house where Summer played. Forensic logic asks one simple question: why? Why would a search extend for miles in every direction, but exclude the closest waterline to the last confirmed location? The answer may be procedural. Teams prioritized accessible terrain, or it may be perceptual. The creek was too small to matter. But in forensic reconstruction, too small is where things hide best. Consider this: if the creek had been included in the initial grid, soil samples could have been taken, sediment tested for trace organic material, and vegetation growth patterns documented. Even in 2025, residual DNA or chemical markers could remain in that soil. The area is still unverified, unexamined, unacknowledged. Every disappearance leaves behind a geography of attention, where people looked, where they didn't. The creek marks the edge of that map. It is the physical equivalent of a deleted file, not erased, just never opened. And like digital data, what's unsearched can still hold the truth. The logic that began with the missing drive now lands here, a possible destination, a place reachable within 30 minutes, hidden behind the house, masked by machinery, ignored by official search teams. If the second drive was real, this creek is where it could have ended. They mapped the hill, the woods, and the roads, but not the only waterline directly below the child's last known play area. If the creek was the physical blind spot, the phone became the digital one. 2 days after Summer Wells vanished, reporters asked Candus whether investigators had taken her phone. Her answer was simple: she had already reset it. She said she'd done it because of stress, that she wanted to clear everything, start fresh, and get rid of the constant calls and messages from people asking questions. It sounded harmless at the time, almost reasonable for a grieving mother under public attack. But from a forensic perspective, a factory reset in the middle of an active investigation is not an emotional reaction. It's a data event. That one action wiped call logs, GPS history, and cached application data, everything that could show where Candus went, who she contacted, and what she searched on June 15, 2021. No statement from TBI ever confirmed that the phone was seized or imaged before the reset. If they did retrieve it, no extraction report was made public. And because the reset happened before police confirmed chain of custody, the digital record of that day effectively vanished with one tap. Yet something unusual happened later. 2 months after the disappearance, community users on Reddit and TikTok began noticing activity linked to Candus's account. Her old TikTok profile, the one she used to post short family clips before Summer vanished, appeared active again for several minutes. Then it disappeared completely. Some claim to have captured screenshots showing her status online, connected through a Tennessee IP address at a time when her husband, Don Wells, was still in jail on unrelated charges. No law enforcement source ever confirmed that reactivation, and these observations remain unverified, drawn from crowd-sourced monitoring. Still, the timing raised a question that has never been publicly answered. If Candus truly reset her phone on June 15th and handed it over, how did the same account come back online from the same state 8 weeks later? To understand why that detail matters, we have to look at how a factory reset actually works. When you reset a modern smartphone, user data, messages, photos, GPS history is deleted from the visible storage. But the device's IMEI number, its digital fingerprint, remains active. The reset doesn't erase the hardware's identity. It simply clears the surface. The operating system is reinstalled, but the phone still exists as a traceable object in network records. Forensic specialists track resets by comparing activation logs. If a device that was supposedly wiped later logs into the same account, two possibilities exist. Either the reset wasn't done correctly, leaving partial data and auto login enabled, or the account was restored from a backup onto a different device. In both cases, it means there was access to the original credentials after the date of the reset. Applying that to the Summer Wells case, the timeline looks like this. June 15, 2021, Summer disappears. Candus claims she resets her phone that evening or the next morning. July-August 2021, investigators continue searching. Don Wells is arrested for DUI and later jailed. Mid-August 2021, the online activity, brief, unexplained, appears on Candus's old account. Then nothing. The account vanishes, the trace ends, and the question remains, who logged in, and why? If Candus was truly overwhelmed and wanted distance from the case, why access a deleted profile weeks later? If she wasn't the one online who had her phone, her SIM card, or her passwords, every option leads to something deliberate, not accidental. When devices reactivate after resets, there's almost always intent behind it. People relog only when they need to check something, delete something they missed, or monitor what others can still see. In a case like this, that means one of two motives: verifying whether investigators had traced the account, or clearing whatever data might have survived. Both are acts of control, not grief. Linking this back to the earlier forensic pattern, the missing drive and the unsearched creek, the reactivation adds the final layer: digital erasure. The car creates mobility, the creek offers a physical blind spot, and the phone closes the loop by removing the rote between the two. Each element isolates the other from proof. Forensic experts call that obstruction of digital evidence. It doesn't require hacking or advanced skills, just the decision to remove data right after a critical event. In investigations of accidental deaths later staged as disappearances, phone resets almost always occur within 24 hours. They serve one purpose: to cut the chain of location data. Once that's gone, no GPS timeline can contradict a personal statement. The story becomes untestable. Even without access to the full phone extraction report, Candus's own admission that she reset the device is what investigators refer to as a behavioral red flag. It's not proof of wrongdoing, but it's behavior inconsistent with innocence in the context of an open search. Ordinary parents preserve information, photos, messages, timestamps, hoping something might help. Deleting everything removes not just memories but evidence. Now combine the three findings from the first act of this investigation. A second drive creates the physical opportunity. An unsearched creek provides the disposal site. A reset phone attempts to erase the line that connects them. All three form a pattern of movement, concealment, and deletion: physical, environmental, and digital. None of them alone prove guilt. Together they show design. If a drive did happen after the 911 call, the phone should show a new tower connection or a shift in GPS coordinates. Resetting it erased that possibility. If something was dropped into the creek, waterlogged soil might still hide traces, but without digital corroboration, there's no way to link movement to location. And when the phone quietly reappears online 2 months later, it closes the circle. Whatever data survived the first reset could have been deleted in the second. The drive removes visibility, The creek removes evidence, the phone removes proof of both. In criminal reconstruction, investigators often say, technology tells the story people won't. Here, technology started to tell one, and then someone made sure it stopped. For 2 years after the disappearance, Candus maintained that she had nothing to hide. She said she didn't know why people focused on her phone or her timeline. Yet that single device could have answered both questions: where she went and when she went there. The reset ended that possibility. So far, no one has produced official logs confirming when the phone was reactivated or by whom. But the existence of that unexplained login sits on the same map as the other anomalies. The alleged second drive and the creek that no one searched are physical acts. The phone's reset is digital, the invisible twin of those same movements. Together they describe the outline of a coordinated disappearance, one that used panic, noise, and technology to create an illusion of loss while controlling every trace of it. A car that leaves after the 911 call. A creek no one examines. A phone that erases its own memory and then briefly comes back to life. It's not proof, but it's precision. 3 fragments that fit so tightly they start to form a design. A second drive creates a physical opportunity. An unsearched creek offers a disposal site. A reset phone attempts to erase the rope between them. The next question is when exactly Summer ceased to exist in this timeline. In every missing person investigation, there's a moment where time stops making sense. For Summer Wells, that moment lasts 90 minutes, the gap between when she was last seen alive and when her mother called 911. It's a stretch of missing time that sits quietly in the middle of a timeline that otherwise seems precise. Every story told about that day bends around it. The day began normally. Candus Bly took her mother, known as Grandma Candy, to a doctor's appointment. Summer came along. Later, they met a teenager named Hunter, a friend of the family, and the group went to Warriors Path State Park. The timeline up to that point is supported by photos and video, the infamous TikTok clip of Summer by the swimming hole, her short hair wet, her body still, her arm resting against a milk jug. That footage has a timestamp close to 3:30 p.m. Hunter told the interview room that they left the park soon after. Around 3:45 p.m., dropped him off at his home, and then Candus drove back toward Ben Hill Road. According to his version, it took less than 30 minutes. He said Summer fell asleep in the truck, and that was the last time he saw her. Candus gave a different account. In her interviews, she stretched the timeline, saying they ran errands after leaving the park, stopping at a grocery store, and possibly the priceless foods in town before heading home. She described coming back to the house, planting flowers with her mother, watching Summer go inside, and noticing she was gone around 6:30 p.m. That's a 2.5-hour gap between leaving the park and the emergency call. On a map, the drive from Warriors Path to Ben Hill Road is less than 25 miles, around 30 minutes with normal traffic. Even adding short errands, the total travel time shouldn't exceed an hour. But in the public version, nearly 90 minutes vanish. Grandma Candy's account, limited and filtered through Candus's retellings, doesn't clarify it. She confirmed going to the park and returning home, but offered no specific times. Her silence becomes part of the pattern. No one who was there agrees on when the day truly ended for Summer. In forensic reconstruction, that gap becomes the axis of everything else. If the last confirmed visual of Summer is at 3:30 p.m. and the 911 call is logged at 6:30, the question isn't where she went. It's when she stopped being there. Every version that exists tries to fill that void. Candus uses errands and chores. Hunter uses short drives and vague waiting. The grandmother's version erases detail altogether. Between them, the story inflates and contracts to hide the one thing they all avoid defining: the exact minute Summer disappeared from their care. Investigators call this kind of manipulation temporal staging, moving the time of an event to make it seem less suspicious. Instead of, "She went missing at 4:30, it becomes, "We realized she was gone at 6:30 by." That 2-hour shift turns a potential accident or domestic emergency in daylight into an unsolved mystery near sunset. The later the time, the less responsibility it appears to carry. If Summer was alive at 6 p.m., then the disappearance happened suddenly, while Candus was at home, surrounded by family. But if she died closer to 4:30 or 5, as the reconstructed timeline suggests, then everything that happened afterward, the flower planting, the search, the phone reset, the second drive, becomes post-event behavior. Not the moment of loss, but the start of concealment. That hour and a half is where logistics and emotion collide. First comes shock, then fear, then the calculation. Someone says, if we tell the truth, we'll lose everything. Someone else says, no one saw anything. We can fix this. Phones are checked, routes are considered, stories begin forming. What's told later as confusion often starts here, in the moment people stop trying to save a life and start trying to save themselves. Now connect that logic to the earlier findings. At 6:30 p.m., Candus calls 911. At roughly the same time, her phone data disappears. A witness later claims to see her driving away from the hill. If that drive happened, it fits perfectly into the back end of this 90-minute void. The first half, 4:30 to 5:30, is the unknown, where the actual event may have occurred. The second half, 5:30 to 6:30, is the staging, the time used to prepare for the call, create a story, and erase tracks. The digital reset supports that sequence. In some cases, people delete data before contacting authorities to make the timeline of communication match their version of events. Removing messages, GPS history, or app activity ensures no contradiction later. A phone reset before or during a 911 call is not an impulsive act. It's a controlled one. So, what could have happened between leaving the park and the emergency call? Forensic reconstruction doesn't guess motive, it traces feasibility. The group leaves the park at 3:45. By 4:15, they should be back near home. Hunter is dropped off around that time. Between 4:30 and 5:30, Candus and her mother are alone with Summer. That's when the critical incident most likely occurred. Whether it was an accident, drowning, heat stroke, or a medical emergency cannot be proven. But if Summer died during that window, every later action aligns logically: the phone reset, the second drive, and the story of the basement door. By 5:30, decisions were already being made. By 6:30, the narrative was ready. And by the time police arrived, the timeline was locked, a version that couldn't be disproved, because the evidence that could have disproved it was already gone. Forensic experts say that missing time is never empty. It's the part of the story where the real event hides, covered by noise. Everything else, statements, interviews, searches, builds around it. What the public remembers as confusion may actually be construction, building a version of the afternoon that pushes the loss later and the responsibility further away. That's what temporal staging does. It rewrites the clock so the truth fits inside a safer hour. 90 minutes might not sound like much, but in a cover-up, it's everything. It's the difference between a parent who didn't see what happened and one who saw it, then tried to make it disappear. And if someone outside the family had taken Summer during those 90 minutes, there's one thing that should have given it away: 16 dogs living on that hill. Not one of them ever made a sound. When investigators first arrived on Ben Hill Road, they noticed something unusual. The Wells property wasn't quiet, it was filled with sound. Roosters, crickets, wind through the trees, and dogs. Dozens of them. In Chris McDonough's interview room video, recorded weeks after the disappearance, he counted between 14 and 16 dogs running freely across the yard. They barked, chased, circled, and howled at almost every visitor. The animals weren't passive. They were loud, territorial, and very familiar with the rhythm of the hill. That fact matters, because on the night Summer disappeared, not one person, not a neighbor, not a family member, not a first responder, reported hearing those dogs bark. No barking during the moment she supposedly vanished. No barking when police vehicles climbed the road. No barking when strangers entered the property. The one sound that should have broken the silence, the alarm of 16 dogs, never came. For anyone who's ever lived in a rural area, that detail stands out. Dogs on large, isolated properties are natural alarms. They bark when cars approach, when footsteps cross the gravel, when someone opens a gate or door. Especially dogs that live outdoors, semi-feral, protective of territory. They don't stay quiet when an unknown human steps inside their space, let alone takes a child. If a stranger had climbed that hill, opened a basement door, and carried Summer away, those dogs should have gone wild. They would have barked, chased, or followed the scent. The commotion would have echoed down Ben Hill Road, and the neighbors, who claimed to hear shouting during the search, would have noticed it earlier. Instead, every account from that evening describes a strange calm. In forensic terms, animal behavior can help define the boundaries of an event. Dogs react not just to movement but to difference, unfamiliar voices, scents, or vibrations. Their silence, therefore, can be evidence. When trained scent dogs later arrived with law enforcement, they picked up Summer's trail briefly around the house and driveway, then lost it completely. No sign of a path leading into the woods. That kind of cutoff is consistent with either one of two scenarios: the scent ending where the child was lifted into a vehicle, or the scent ending because the event occurred indoors. The problem with the first scenario is noise. 16 dogs don't let someone drive up quietly, open a car door, and leave with a child. Even if the abductor were fast, the chaos of barking would have drawn immediate attention. But the second scenario, the event happening inside the home or near people the dogs already knew, fits the silence perfectly. Let's take that silence and place it on the timeline. Between 4:30 and 6:30 p.m., the 90-minute void, no one outside the family saw Summer. Within that same period, no one heard barking or panic from the dogs. The two absences overlap exactly. If she had been taken by an outsider, the dogs would have alerted, breaking the void with noise. They didn't. Which means whatever happened to Summer likely happened inside that circle of familiarity, the house, the yard, or the immediate family. McDonough's video footage reinforces this logic. When he visited the property for his interview, the dogs followed him constantly, circling, barking, nipping. They responded instantly to his movement and voice. At one point, he noted on camera that they were extremely alert and protective. That's how they behaved with everyone unfamiliar. But the night of the disappearance, they stayed quiet even as emergency vehicles arrived. That's the kind of silence that doesn't happen naturally. It has to be contextual, triggered by familiarity or absence of perceived threat. Another point worth noting, the property's geography. The main driveway curves upward from Ben Hill Road. Any vehicle approaching produces sound, gravel crunching, headlights sweeping across the slope, engine echoes between trees. The dogs would have detected that long before a stranger reached the porch. Yet none of the family members mentioned hearing dogs bark when Summer supposedly went missing. Not even once. Candus and Dawn later used that silence to defend themselves, suggesting that the abductor must have been fast, or someone she knew. But those explanations contradict their own timeline. If someone she knew took her, that person would have been part of their social circle, a neighbor or acquaintance. Still, there's no record of any such visitor confirmed by TBI that day. And if the dogs stayed silent because the event happened inside, that theory circles back to the family once again. Forensic investigators call this negative evidence, proof that comes not from what exists, but from what doesn't. No broken fences. No tire marks. No barking. Each absence supports one simple conclusion: there was no external intrusion. The event originated within the property, among people or sounds the dogs trusted. And that silence fits too neatly beside the 90-minute gap, the phone reset, and the possible second drive. Every physical trace of an external intruder is missing, but behavioral traces, the kind animals leave, point inward. By now, the pattern is undeniable. A timeline with missing minutes, a drive that possibly left the hill, a creek that no one searched, a phone that erased its own record, and 16 dogs that didn't bark. Each silence reinforces the other. Together, they build a perimeter not around the crime scene, but around the truth, a truth contained entirely within that household. 16 dogs never sounded an alarm because, in their world, nothing abnormal entered the property. Whatever happened to Summer happened from within. And if that's true, then the only remaining witnesses who might know what really took place that day are the ones who can't yet speak for themselves. The three brothers who were inside that house when Summer disappeared. When the search for Summer Wells turned from hours into days, the focus of investigators quietly shifted from the woods outside the house to the people living inside it. Within a week, Child Protective Services stepped in and removed the 3 remaining Wells boys from their parents' custody. The official reason was never stated, but reports described concerns for welfare. They were placed under state supervision and, since that day, have not been heard from publicly again. No interviews, no photographs, no testimonies. In a case built almost entirely on statements, that silence stands out. The brothers were in the house when Summer allegedly went downstairs to play. They were the only other people inside, apart from their mother and grandmother, during the time Candus claims her daughter vanished. Their words could have confirmed the timeline or shattered it completely. Instead, they disappeared from the narrative while never leaving the state of Tennessee. According to Candus's original account, Summer walked into the basement, possibly to play with her toys, and was gone within 2 minutes. No scream, no sound, just gone. Forensic logic doesn't accept that kind of vanishing without corroboration. The only people who could verify if Summer actually went into that basement are her brothers. They were in the same house. They would have heard footsteps, doors opening, a television running, or the sound of their mother calling from outside. But their version of events has never been made public, not even summarized, not even paraphrased. That absence is not a coincidence, it's procedural. Under U.S. law, when minors are involved in open or ongoing investigations, their statements are sealed. It's meant to protect them, to keep media and speculation away from children already affected by trauma. But in cases like this, sealing also erases the most important testimony available. If the boys' statements aligned perfectly with their parents, there would be no harm in law enforcement confirming it. A single sentence. Their accounts were consistent with the parents' timeline. Would have closed speculation. Yet that confirmation never came. So the question becomes unavoidable: is their silence protective or strategic? If the brothers had described sounds that didn't fit the story, for instance, if one heard a loud thump, or saw Candus leave the property, or noticed Summer not playing at all, that testimony would directly undermine every public statement made since. In that sense, silence becomes not just protection but control. From a forensic reconstruction standpoint, this missing layer of witness input is critical. Without it, the timeline of June 15th is incomplete. Every investigative model requires at least one independent witness inside the environment at the moment of the event. Here, 3 existed, all biologically related to the victim, and none of their words are known. The absence of those voices leaves a hole that no physical evidence has filled. Still, patterns of behavior and circumstantial data can speak where testimony does not. Even without the brothers' statements, other elements remain measurable: the unsearched creek, the missing drive, the silent dogs, the reset phone, and the 90-minute void. Those pieces describe an event contained within the property, isolated from outside interference. The lack of barking supports the theory that no stranger entered. The missing digital data aligns with intentional erasure. The silence of those boys affects more than the story. It affects the logic of the investigation itself. Without their perspective, every physical clue must stand alone, unsupported by the most basic question: what did they see, hear, or feel in that house before the shouting began? Did they hear Summer walking toward the basement? Did they hear the back door open? Did anyone cry out? Even one detail, a direction of movement, a sound, a time, could anchor the reconstruction. Its absence forces investigators and analysts to build an entire timeline on assumption. It's also worth considering how the state's intervention shaped public perception. When CPS removed the boys, many believed it confirmed wrongdoing by the parents. Others saw it as a standard precaution. Either way, the move cut off access to the last human witnesses to whatever happened inside that home. In protecting them, the system may have also buried their version of events alongside the rest of the case file. Years later, the brothers are teenagers now, older, capable of understanding what happened around them. Yet still nothing. No leaks, no comments, no reports of re-interviews. The secrecy is airtight. That degree of containment usually happens only when a case remains open under suspicion of foul play, which means that somewhere within law enforcement archives, 3 separate testimonies exist, sealed, describing the last day of their sister's life, and the public will likely never hear them. In forensic reconstruction, missing testimony is almost as informative as available evidence. It tells you where the pressure points are, the sections of truth that can't withstand exposure. If these boys had simply confirmed that Summer went downstairs to play and was never seen again, that statement could have been summarized without harm. The fact that it wasn't implies the opposite, that their answers complicated, not clarified, the story. From a distance, it's easy to imagine these boys as bystanders, too young to understand. But within forensic logic, they are key witnesses whose memories could bridge every gap in the timeline. Their silence is not absence, it's evidence of what cannot yet be said. 3 boys are still alive, but their version of that day is locked away with the case file. Silence, once again, becomes part of the evidence. And to understand how silence can repeat itself within the same bloodline, how disappearance becomes a family pattern, the investigation now turns backward to another missing woman with the same last name, Rose Bly. In 2009, 12 years before Summer Wells vanished, another woman with the same last name disappeared under strikingly similar circumstances. Her name was Rose Marie Bly, the older sister of Candus Bly. She lived in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, over 800 miles from Ben Hill Road, but the echoes between her case and Summer's are impossible to ignore. On the night of August 21, 2009, Rose left home saying she was driving to meet a cousin in the nearby town of Cushing. She never arrived. 2 days later, her car, a white Pontiac Grand Prix, was found in a parking lot about 5 miles from her home. The doors were locked. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Rose herself was gone. Despite searches, media appeals, and polygraphs, no trace of her was ever found. No body, no witnesses, no resolution. It's a phrase that now defines 2 generations of the same family: no body, no resolution. In both cases, the person who disappeared was last seen by relatives, inside a familiar environment. For Rose, it was her home. For Summer, it was her family's property. Both vanishings occurred in daylight, in rural settings, and both produced timelines that dissolve under scrutiny. The relatives who were last with them gave statements filled with small contradictions, missing minutes, uncertain details, shifting explanations. Neither disappearance resulted in a criminal charge. Both froze into permanent ambiguity. When you compare the public reactions, the similarities deepen. After Rose went missing, her family gave interviews expressing grief, but avoiding specifics. "We just don't know what happened," they said repeatedly. There was emotion, but not clarity. Candus herself, then in her 20s, told reporters that she couldn't understand how someone could just vanish. 12 years later, she used the same phrasing about her daughter. "I just don't know how she disappeared like that." The wording, the cadence, even the resignation are nearly identical. In forensic psychology, this isn't coincidence. It's what's known as pattern narrative repetition. When language used to survive one trauma unconsciously resurfaces in another, it can reveal both conditioning and concealment. When a family endures one unresolved disappearance, certain behaviors are learned. They learn what kind of statements sound safe. They learn that if there's no body, there's no crime. They learn that silence buys time and ambiguity buys protection. Over time, that survival pattern can evolve into an instinct, a behavioral reflex triggered when loss or danger reappears. This concept, called patterned concealment behavior, doesn't mean guilt, it means replication. In the absence of closure, families often repeat what worked last time, or what didn't hurt them legally. When a prior missing person case in the same family remained unsolved, it can unconsciously teach those involved how to manage the next crisis. That learned response includes avoiding exact times, shifting the emotional focus to faith or fate, and maintaining the missing label instead of accepting death. It's a coping strategy that doubles as a protective narrative. That's why both cases hinge on the same idea: she just disappeared. It's a phrase that ends conversation. It cancels logic. It reframes every question, from "what happened?" to "where did she go?" By using the passive disappeared, responsibility evaporates. No one acts, something simply happens. For investigators, that phrasing is a red flag. It signals psychological distancing, a way to describe an event while avoiding ownership of it. When used once, it's emotion. When used twice across 2 generations, it's conditioning. The emotional function behind that language is powerful. Missing keeps hope alive, even if it means denying the obvious. A missing person might come home, a dead one never will. Psychologically, this narrative offers comfort. It allows family members to exist in a suspended state, where tragedy hasn't fully happened yet. It also removes accountability. You can't be responsible for something that just disappeared. In both Rosie's and Summer's cases, that mental framework defined every decision afterward. Neither disappearance was treated by family as a crime from the start. Both were presented as mysteries, accidents of fate. Both timelines were managed through selective memory, emphasizing emotion over detail, faith over forensics. Rose's mother, Candus, was the last confirmed person to see her alive. 12 years later, she was also one of the last to see Summer. 2 disappearances, 1 matriarch, both ending in silence. No evidence has ever linked the two, but the overlap is undeniable. Same family structure, same pattern of missing minutes, same emotional script repeated verbatim. Each time, the same mechanisms emerge. First, uncertainty. Timelines blur, hours stretch or collapse. Second, emotional framing. The story is told through feelings, not facts. Third, narrative freeze. The event becomes something unchangeable. She vanished. That's all we know. This behavioral triad, uncertainty, emotion, freeze, protects the family psychologically but paralyzes the investigation legally. It turns grief into insulation. So what happens when the same script repeats twice? 1 disappearance can be misfortune. 2 in the same bloodline, with the same unanswered patterns, starts to look like a behavior. And while this internal pattern shields them from scrutiny, it also creates another, one turned outward, a distraction built for public attention. That external misdirection came in the form of a story about a red truck that no one could ever find. Within days of Summer Wells' disappearance, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation released an alert. They were looking for the driver of a red Toyota Tacoma, model year late 1990s to early 2000s, possibly with white buckets in the bed. The message spread across social media and national news. It sounded like a solid lead, a vehicle seen in the area around the time Summer went missing. But the origin of that detail wasn't law enforcement. It came from inside the Wells family. In interviews, Don Wells mentioned the truck first. He said a neighbor had seen it near their property, that it might have been following his daughter, that maybe a guy in a red truck had taken her. No one else ever confirmed that sighting. The TBI statement didn't name a witness, a location, or a time. It simply repeated that they were looking for information about such a vehicle. Over the next months, no photograph, no license plate, and no driver were ever found. The truck became the centerpiece of speculation, a single red image around which the public could build a story. Officially, the Buolo existed, but the suspicion appears to have started as a family claim, not an independent discovery. In other words, investigators may have been chasing a ghost from the start, a tip born from the very people now considered inconsistent witnesses. No second witness ever came forward to say they'd seen that truck. No tire impressions near the Wells driveway matched its supposed size. No surveillance camera captured it on Ben Hill Road. The truck was never connected to the scene by forensic evidence. 4 years later, it remains a talking point without a trace. So why did it matter so much? Why did a case that showed no physical signs of abduction need an abductor at all? In behavioral forensics, such inventions are called diversions, deliberate redirections meant to move suspicion away from the source. A red truck does exactly that. It creates a picture simple enough for the public to hold: an unknown predator, a sudden snatch, a vehicle vanishing into the woods. It replaces a complex domestic event with a cinematic threat. The public, the press, even local authorities tend to follow what looks like a clear external danger. The tactic is as old as the investigations themselves. When an incident inside a household becomes impossible to explain, an outsider narrative fills the vacuum. The red truck became that outsider. It drew attention outward, away from the hill, away from the basement, and away from the timeline that never added up. It provided a visual scapegoat for an invisible event. There's also a psychological component. The Wells family story already relied on the idea of disappearance without conflict. A child, just gone. The red truck gave that narrative structure. It made the impossible seem possible. She didn't vanish, she was taken. It's easier to accept the existence of a stranger than the implication of someone familiar. If the true scenario was an accident or concealment within the home, introducing a vehicle accomplishes two crucial things. First, it pushes the focus outward, removing scrutiny from the family and redirecting it toward an anonymous suspect who can't defend himself. Second, it explains the missing body. If a stranger drove away, there's a reason no remains were found. He took her with him. That single statement protects every inconsistency in the timeline. It makes the silence of the dogs irrelevant, the creek unimportant, the reset phone meaningless. All threads point outward, away from the hill. This is how diversions work. They don't have to hold up under evidence. They just have to hold attention. The red truck did exactly that. For weeks, the public flooded hotlines with tips about red vehicles. TBI followed up on each, only to rule them out one by one. Meanwhile, the critical early hours, when evidence could have been preserved or contradictions tested, slipped away. Even after the agency publicly said they'd located and cleared the truck, the story lived on. News outlets kept the image. Commenters insisted there must have been another red Tacoma, one that got away. The rumor became self-sustaining. By the time investigators refocused on the family, the narrative had already burned itself into public memory. That's the power of a clean distraction. It gives the public a villain and the family a shield. It fills the space where truth might have lived with something easier to believe, and it leaves investigators chasing not evidence, but imagination. In the absence of a body, a red truck became the perfect ghost, visible enough to talk about, invisible enough to never be found. Next comes the question no one wants to ask: how could investigators, with so many inconsistencies and blind spots, have missed the clues directly beneath their feet? The answer lies not in what they did search, but in what they carefully avoided. Every disappearance begins as a race against time. In the first 48 hours, decisions determine everything: what gets searched, what gets collected, and what gets ignored. For Summer Wells, those hours passed under flashing lights and press briefings, but behind the noise, key investigative steps were quietly left undone, or, at least, never acknowledged. Start with the basics: the creek. 30 meters from the back of the house, a shallow stream runs behind the property, never drained, never tested. No record shows that soil samples or water analysis were conducted there. That alone breaks standard forensic protocol. In every child disappearance with potential foul play, immediate water source mapping within 100 meters of the last known location is one of the first steps. It's simple logic: if a child vanished, water is both a hazard and a hiding place. The creek behind the Wells home fits that rule perfectly. Yet, it was omitted entirely from official statements. Then there's the digital forensics. No public record confirms that investigators extracted GPS data from Candus Bly's phone, her vehicle, or Don Wells's truck. When asked, TBI representatives only said that all electronic devices were reviewed. That phrase means nothing in practice. Reviewed could mean physically looked at, not forensically imaged. No timestamp, no cell tower triangulation, no retrieval of deleted location history has ever been presented. For a case built on timelines, the absence of digital verification leaves the entire chronology in the realm of belief, not evidence. Next, the workers. Several locals reported that a land clearing crew operated near the property on June 15th, the same day Summer vanished. Yet, there's no mention in the official record that these individuals were ever questioned, nor whether their equipment or vehicles were examined for trace evidence. If they were interviewed, those transcripts remain sealed. Again, no confirmation, not even an acknowledgement that they existed. And then, the brothers. 3 boys removed from the home within days of the disappearance, the only living witnesses inside the house. Their statements were never summarized, their presence never referenced in any press briefing. Their words, like the creek and the GPS data, simply disappeared into confidentiality. Compare that to the standard investigative framework for a missing child with suspected foul play. In FBI and state-level protocols, The first 24 hours demand immediate digital extraction, forensic imaging of all phones and vehicles to establish movement patterns, complete environmental survey, mapping every water source, shed, structure, and terrain depression within 500 feet, witness verification, including all on-site workers, family members, and last contact individuals with time-stamped interviews. Those are not exceptional procedures, they're the foundation of modern search operations. Each builds accountability. Each prevents later confusion. None of them appear, in detail, in the Wells investigation record available to the public. Why not? Several explanations fit, none of them comforting. First, the investigator's own words. Early on, TBI publicly stated, "We have found no evidence of abduction and no evidence of foul play." That sentence, meant to calm speculation, boxed the investigation in. By ruling out criminal intent before the facts were complete, they created a paradox. To revisit that conclusion later would mean admitting an early error. Bureaucratically, it's easier to let a case remain missing than to reclassify it as homicide by neglect. Second, the pressure. The Wells case exploded across national media within days. Every statement was dissected, every update amplified. Local agencies were flooded with false tips, psychics, and online sleuths. Under that glare, officials often default to risk control, sticking to a single message, limiting disclosure, and avoiding statements that might ignite public outrage or implicate the family too soon. In that environment, silence feels like safety. Third, resources. The terrain around Ben Hill is rough, remote, and sprawling. Thousands of acres were searched, impressive in scale, but not in precision. The wide area approach looks good in press conferences, but it spreads manpower thin. The deeper, smaller searches, the kind that involve draining creeks, scanning soil, and digitally mapping devices, require specialists and time. They also carry political cost if they point back to the family after the agency has already said, "No foul play." The impact of those blind spots is measurable. Because the creek was never examined, the most accessible disposal site remains a mystery. Because GPS data was never released, the possible second drive can't be tested. Because the worker interviews were never confirmed, an entire category of potential witnesses vanished. And because the brothers' statements were sealed, the final internal verification, the voices of those inside the house, remained silent. Instead, the investigation's public focus drifted toward the red truck. A single unverified lead, endlessly repeated, swallowed every other anomaly. The predator unknown narrative became safer, more presentable, easier to defend. Meanwhile, the real inconsistencies, physical, digital, behavioral, stayed buried beneath procedural restraint. Forensic reconstruction is not about blame, it's about sequence. Each omission creates a shadow, and when those shadows line up, they outline the shape of what's missing. This case doesn't suffer from lack of clues. It suffers from selective blindness. Evidence existed, but the steps to confirm it led too close to home, too close to the people giving the interviews, too close to the version of events officials had already endorsed. The investigation did not fail because it lacked leads. It failed because it refused to fully pursue the ones that pointed too close to home. And when you connect all those blind spots, the creek, the drive, the phone, the witnesses, they start to form something clearer than silence, the outline of what really happened. To understand what happened to Summer Wells, all fragments must align, not as rumor, but as structure. Every inconsistency, silence, and blind spot fits into a single pattern when arranged by time instead of testimony. What emerges is not accusation, but reconstruction, a hypothesis drawn from logic and probability. Between 4 and 5 p.m., something irreversible occurred. Summer likely experienced a fatal incident, accidental drowning, suffocation, or a medical event, either inside the house or in the family vehicle. No evidence suggests an outsider was present. No witnesses reported strangers, noise, or intrusion. Within that hour, the silence of the dogs, the absence of screams, and the children's isolation point to a domestic accident that turned catastrophic. From 5 to 5:30 p.m., panic replaced reason. 2 adults, Candus and her mother Candy, would have been present, possibly joined later by Dawn through phone contact. In that half hour, decisions were made. Instead of calling 911 immediately, They may have convinced themselves there was still time to manage what had happened, to fix it before authorities arrived. The shift from tragedy to concealment likely began here. Between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m., the narrative took shape. The story of Summer going to the basement, the flower planting, and the sudden realization of disappearance. All those elements could have been staged during this window. Rooms were tidied, a few items moved, and the official sequence constructed. What investigators later called inconsistencies. In statements might simply be traces of this rewriting process, people trying to recall a scene that was partially invented. At 6:30 p.m., Candus called 911, establishing the official timestamp. That call fixed the beginning of the search and erased the previous 2 hours from scrutiny. From that point forward, everything said and done was anchored to the illusion that Summer was still alive when the call was placed. But what happened after that call remains the most telling part. Between 6:30 and 7 p.m., a witness allegedly saw Candus's vehicle on a different road, miles from the house. That 30-minute gap, the missing drive, aligns perfectly with the time frame needed to transport or dispose of an object discreetly. The nearest logical destination, the creek behind the property or an adjacent field accessible by back roads. If that sighting is accurate, the drive represents not confusion, but purpose. Later that night or early the next morning, the phone reset occurred. The device that could have recorded those GPS movements was wiped clean. Whether the reset happened at home or elsewhere, its intent is clear: to erase location history and communication logs that might contradict the 911 narrative. The result was a digital void exactly where a physical movement might have left trace evidence. 2 months later, the same account, once deleted, briefly reappeared online, suggesting someone accessed or reactivated it, perhaps to verify whether the reset had been successful, or to remove the remnants that survived the first wipe. Either way, it indicates ongoing control over the digital narrative long after the official search had cooled. Every earlier piece of this investigation supports that chain. The drive provided the means to move evidence. The creek offered the easiest, closest place to hide it. The phone erased the trail connecting them. The 90-minute gap defined the real timeline of loss. The dog's silence ruled out intrusion. The brothers' sealed testimony withheld the only internal witness accounts. The Rose Bly case revealed that this pattern, disappearance without body, story without proof, had precedent in the same bloodline. The red truck was a distraction, introduced to redirect public attention outward. And the institutional gaps, the unsearched creek, the missing GPS, the absent forensic tests, ensured the case would stay frozen, suspended between doubt and denial. As a reconstruction, this timeline doesn't overreach. It doesn't name a perpetrator or claim certainty. It functions as a forensic model, not a verdict, a logical structure that connects known facts and reported behaviors without contradiction. It explains every silence and every inconsistency in a single framework. No single detail here proves intent, but together, they create a map of a mission, a sequence of actions that could not occur by chance. In investigations, the truth often hides not in what is found, but in what was never searched, never recorded, never released. Summer didn't vanish. She was moved, concealed, and then systematically erased from both the physical and digital record, in the exact sequence you would expect in a perfect evidence removal operation. The only remaining question is not whether this sequence is possible. It is who, within that house, had enough time, access, and motive to follow it through.